Welcome to the Progression Health Podcast, episode 3. I'm here with Richie Kirwan, a fellow Irishman, and he is going to introduce himself. So, Richie, will you tell us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on, Ross. My name is Richie Kirwan. I am a nutritionist and nutrition researcher at Liverpool John Moores University. And my research looks at the role of muscle mass and function in cardiovascular disease, but in cardiometabolic disease. So things like heart disease, diabetes, and basically how our muscle and then how diet and exercise, which affects our muscle, can affect our future risk of cardiometabolic disease.
Very good. Yeah, very relevant research with the rise in obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely won't be out of business for a while.
No, people will be flying to you soon, hopefully. I'll throw you a curveball to start. So when will Waterford win the Liam McCarthy Cup? I know it's overdue. I know you're knocking on the door. When's it going to happen for Waterford?
God almighty, we've been saying it's going to happen since the late 90s. And I distinctly remember, like 97, I think was our year where we're like, we're going to win it. And then, on and off since then, we've been saying we are. But look, I think the last time we won was 1953. And God, it might be 2053 by the time we get again. We get so close every year, But I sure look at. You know yourself as a Galway man. You knocked us out of there before as well. So, look, I'll keep the fingers crossed, but I won't hold my breath.
Yeah. Oh, with Joe Cannon gone, I think that's us gone as well. So I'm not one to be talking or asking any questions like that. But yeah, then just back to your own kind of work, and I saw in your website you mentioned. You talked about like body image and people's relationship with food, more back to your expertise and stuff. Do you want to talk just a little bit about the importance of a healthy relationship with food and, what that would kind of look like? And then how you kind of work with clients with improving their relationship with food, if that's something they need to work on.
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose one thing to preface that with is kind of why I find it important. And so when I first got into nutrition, I would have been about 14 or 15 years of age. And I used to be overweight as a teenager myself. And I got into nutrition then at 14 or 15, started reading up a lot about it. And I started losing weight myself. And I will be completely honest, I definitely had some form of disordered eating back then. And it's not a good condition to live with, and it is something that can stick with people for a very, very long time. So for quite a long time myself, I had a poor relationship with food, and it's not a good way to be. And by poor relationship, I'm going to say I would consider certain foods good or certain foods bad, and eating those kind of foods would affect my mood and basically how I felt about myself. So if I ate something that I consider inverted commas bad, I would feel bad about myself. I'd feel guilty. And I see that so much these days. And social media has a massive role to play in that, because people like, really, really nice black and white answers, which food is good, which food is bad, because it's easier to understand, it's easier to digest. But it's so poor for people's opinion, for people's thoughts around food, and it does nothing for them. And I see people struggling with their relationship with food. And so for me, when I work with people, it's really, really important that one thing that I focus on is the language that we use around food. So for example, I will never use the word good food or bad food with somebody, because I don't think that there are good foods or bad foods. Food is food. And, I think we put moral values on them ourselves, which we don't need to. So I'm very, very kind of strict about, when I speak with a client, if I hear them using a certain word, like once, they've said their bit, I'll say, look, I just want to bring to your attention here that you said this. I don't think we should use that word. It's not good for your mentality around food at all. The same thing goes with the way we actually deal with how they handle their food. So for example, if people give dietary recommendations, let's say people give some macro and calorie recommendations or something like that, I stay away from fixed values. And what I do is I tend to work within ranges, because I think flexibility is hugely important for, let's say, fostering a good relationship with food. If you're flexible in your approach to how you handle food and how you think about food, it's going to be much easier to develop a good relationship. So, for example, I'll never say, okay, you need to eat 1,700 calories and you need to eat exactly 90 grams of protein or something like that. I'll say, look, we've got this range, eat within it. If you're in that range, you're grand. If you fall outside of that range, you're also grand as well. But like more of the time, we'll try and eat within that range. And I try to kind of also incorporate foods that traditionally, again, people would consider bad or not diet foods as much as possible into somebody's diet, because I want people to enjoy their food, because I think food is one of the greatest enjoyments that we have in life, and people should be able to enjoy it. So I try to encourage people to incorporate those foods into their diet, to encourage them to eat out with friends, and to, I suppose, to relax around food, because a lot of people are very, very uptight about it. So kind of in a nutshell, I don't want to go on about it too much, but like that's kind of a little bit of my philosophy around coaching.
Brilliant. Yeah. So being flexible, and actually, I had a coach myself, and one thing he was telling me is, literally exercise that flexibility. Go and have these meals out that'll test your, ability to kind of enjoy the food and not worry too much about it. That was huge for me. And then just not stressing too much over it is big. Something you said is about genetics, and I hear some people say, "Oh, sure, I don't have the genetics for this," or "I don't have the genetics for that." What would you say to a client who is focusing on genetics and they kind of maybe use it as like a limiting belief, or they think they just can never be a certain way because of the genetics they were endowed with?
Yeah, so it is a common conversation, funnily enough. One thing I say to people is, and I find myself using this phrase a lot, and using it more and more, and I use it with myself a lot as well. And it's, comparison is the thief of joy. It's very, very easy to compare ourselves with somebody else. So, like, to give an extreme example, I'll talk about, let's say, let's talk about fitness influencers, and people who have absolutely spectacular genetics when it comes to building muscle and staying lean. And people see these individuals who have like absolutely spectacular physiques, and like, and by saying that they have good genetics for those physiques, I'm not saying that they don't work for them. I'm sure they absolutely do. But some physiques are potentially not attainable for certain individuals, and we have to be aware of that. So what I talk to clients about is, I say, like, we're not comparing ourselves to anybody else. We're not comparing ourselves to this guy on or this girl on Instagram or wherever. What we're going to do is we're just going to support ourselves in making improvements in what we do, in our actions, in our behaviors. And I never set solid goals like for a client. And I know that sounds almost counterintuitive for some people. I never say, okay, in 8 weeks we are going to lose 4 kilos. I'll never say that. I'm never going to say to somebody, okay, we are going to reduce your waist circumference by such and such. Or I don't do that, because I don't think that is useful for people. It's nice to have goals like that for some individuals, but for me, I prefer to work with individuals and say, okay, look, maybe we're not going to focus specifically on a weight to lose, but we will focus on certain weight loss techniques, which involve eating better, exercising more regularly, practicing portion control, etc. So yeah, it's a matter of helping individuals get better over time. That better doesn't exactly have a fully defined form when we start out our coaching, because I think, like, from my perspective as a coach, I don't know what this person is capable of. Okay, and I think it's irresponsible of a coach to say to somebody, yeah, we're going to get you jacked and tan in 8 weeks. I don't think that's realistic, because come the end of those 8 weeks, if somebody's not jacked and tan, they will feel incredibly disappointed. Whereas at the end of those 8 weeks, if you can say, okay, this is where we are now, look where you came from, look at all of that progress that you've made, you're doing amazingly. And I think that's just a nicer approach to use when speaking with individuals.
Yeah. Oh, you're bringing up so many points there. Like, I think all people need to improve their kind of metabolic profile is like 5% reduction in weight loss. So if they were able to maintain that for their whole life, that'd be a big win in itself.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I remember seeing as well. There's a page. I think the guy's called Obese to Beast is his name, and he basically went from like morbidly, like imagine the most obese person, like 400 plus pounds down to I think he's like around 180 now, and he did a bodybuilding show, and like
Oh, wow.
he still has kind of skin folds, like excess loose skin, but like his physique is like amazing compared to what it used to be. His quality of life, his longevity, his life expectancy is huge, and like you said, comparison is the thief of joy. If he compares himself to anyone else, he'll completely take away from the amazing progress he's made in his own journey. So, yeah,
Yeah.
really good points there. Yeah. Um, and then how can we practice kind of like being more moderate and flexible? So I think you're talking about a little bit about black and white thinking. It's so easy to do that. How do you kind of get people to a place where they get away from the black and white? I kind of say into the gray, because I think people are just very easily led into the black and white thinking nowadays.
I know I like that you use that phrase into the gray, because I think it's a really important area. It's difficult to navigate. Like you said, black and white is easy. Okay, good, bad, yes, no, do this, don't do this. Whereas when you've got a gray area and you've got so much flexibility, it is difficult for people, and it does need to be practiced. So, for example, one thing that I will do with people is, like I said earlier, is I will encourage them to incorporate, certain foods that they might not associate with, being particularly healthy, or might not associate with weight loss, into their diet regularly. So, for example, when I work with somebody, I'll usually write up a couple of sample days of eating. And I'll say, look, this is what your eating could look like. And I always kind of throw in a load of caveats about, okay, this is not how I want you to eat. This is just to give you an example, because people like examples to follow, to give them an idea. And I'll incorporate, like, I'll always ask somebody, what are your favorite foods when we're working together, what foods you don't want to eat as well. And I'll incorporate some of those favorite foods into a meal plan. And I'll say to them, okay, when we're working together, I want you to plan a couple of days ahead, okay, and incorporate some of these, foods into your day of eating, based on some of the guidelines that we have. Okay, so like, I want you to eat within a certain range of calories, certain amount of protein. I'd say pop this food in here, work around that, and go from there. And that's how we'll start out. Okay, now that, while there's some flexibility in that, there's still a certain amount of rigidity in that. And I do think that, to a certain extent, a little bit of a rigidity at the start of a program to help people learn is useful. But then as we move forward, what I like to do is I like to get people to relax a little bit more about it. So, for example, I'll say, okay, look, you're going out this weekend. Don't track. Go out, enjoy your food. The next day, we're just going to track as normal. We're not going to make any alterations to your food. We're not going to say, okay, like you're going to eat a load the day before. Let's make cut down your calories a lot the next day after. In general, I'll try not to do that, because I just want to encourage people to have. Again, it comes back to having that better relationship with food. It's like, it's not that you're punishing yourself for what you ate the day before by eating less the day after. It's just like, right, I'm having a good night out with my friends. I'm eating a little bit more than normal. I'm probably enjoying it a lot more, enjoying myself. Then I'm just getting back to normal the next day.
Yeah, it sounds very reasonable what you're doing, and like kind of very mindful as well. It's like, I'm not going to have this, night out with my friends and just kind of try and make up for lost time in terms of I've been so rigid that I need to take this opportunity. And then also just kind of bouncing back and not doing anything too restrictive on the other end, when you're getting back to your normality the following Monday as well.
Yeah.
That's great.
But I think people need that bit of flexibility, because if people get, like, again, I said, a little bit of rigidity in when starting out, it can be useful for some people, but you can't maintain that for the rest of your life. We live in a very fluid society where we can't control everything, and I think we have to learn how to be able to give up that control. And when that comes to food, we need to learn how to do that too as well.
Yeah, yeah. I was just thinking about, for some reason, we're talking about nutrition. It came into my head when I was back home. I was eating poorly for like a couple of weeks, like one summer, and I was like, it's mad how that can happen. But then also give it a couple of months, couple of years later, and you can get back to like a really kind of healthy place. Like it's amazing if you're flexible to give yourself a break. Really, you can really make a lot of progress. And like one kind of, quote unquote slip up in your diet isn't final. There's always a new day, start again fresh on the Monday, go again and pick up where you left off.
Yeah. One thing I actually say, and I'm gonna kind of call out this word. Like if I was talking to a client and if they said I slipped up bad last night, I'd hop in straight away and I say you didn't slip up. You enjoyed yourself. You had a good night out. That's what people do. It was one night out. Look, but I will say, like, if somebody's like suddenly they decide, okay, like I'm gonna go out every single night and go out to restaurants and just eat a ridiculous amount of food, then it's like, okay, look, you know, you are. I think when it comes to diet, you are what you do regularly. Okay. So if you're having a meal out on the weekends or 2 nights during the week, so what if the rest of your diet is like really, really well dialed in? But I don't consider that a slip up by any means. I consider that living life. Whereas if somebody's doing it every day, then yeah, you need to kind of intervene a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. You need to be aware of what you're doing. I think if you were to apply the 80-20 rule to a year, that 20% would add up to something like 72 or 73 days where you didn't focus or prioritize your health, 100%, and you kind of allowed yourself to be more flexible. So like that's a lot. That's a big chunk of the year. Like, it's over like one day out of the week each year. So it's huge.
I also think you can prioritize your health in a passive way. Like it doesn't need to be like this active process where you're constantly thinking, okay, I need to do this. I think like with the establishment of habits over time, people just get good at like eating well, controlling their portions, like getting lots of fruit and vegetables into their diet. I just think it becomes normal.
Yeah, eating intuitively, it becomes ingrained almost. Do
Yeah.
you recommend eating intuitively to clients? Is that something that you use?
So interesting enough, it's not something that I've looked into a huge amount, and I won't actually comment on it because I don't fully understand the scope of intuitive eating, and I'd hate to let's say insult the people who've created intuitive eating by misrepresenting it. So yeah, it's not something that I use, but it's definitely something I want to learn more about.
Yeah, very good answer, Richie. I haven't fully studied it or looked into it, but I know a little bit about it. And just that whole idea of like kind of giving yourself a break, being flexible, you're kind of mirroring a lot of what the fundamentals of intuitive eating are. So I think you'd be in a good place to learn about it. Um,
Fantastic.
are there any kind of foods that help people be more flexible? Like, is there any kind of common foods you would say, there's no harm to have this, or certain foods that people have difficulty with, clients, for example, that maybe they don't allow themselves to have, or they have trouble moderating?
So it can like trigger foods is a word that I will occasionally use. And I'll give an example of, for example, let's say crisps. So some individuals have very little ability to restrain themselves when it comes to eating crisps. There's like they start one and then it's just like you down the whole pack. And I'm not talking about like the little kind of individual serving packs of potatoes that we used to get when we were kids. I'm talking about like the big family packs that you get in the supermarkets these days. So in general, I don't like to restrict food. I don't say to somebody, okay, I think we shouldn't eat this or we shouldn't eat that. I'm very, very much in favor of encouraging people to incorporate foods that they really enjoy into their diet. Like, so for example, like I love ice cream and I have it multiple times a week. I just think it's, my life is better because I have ice cream in it. Like the same way some people like they're better people because they have coffee. I'm a better person because I got ice cream. But for some individuals, I will try as much as possible to incorporate that in. But if I'm seeing that they're having incredible difficulty with restraint around certain foods, and if I find that it's impacting them both psychologically in terms that they feel really bad about the way that they're eating it, or if it's impacting them physically in terms of like it's potentially holding them back from making progress, I will say, okay, look, let's maybe avoid having that in the house for a while. But one thing that I'm very, very clear about is I'll say, we're not having it in the house. So it's not something that they can reach to in times of stress, for example. But I will say, look, if you're out and about and if you want to get a small pack, absolutely do it. Okay. Like I'm not going to say you can't have it, but it's just making it a little bit more difficult for it to be, for example, something that somebody could binge on, and just kind of, genuinely, if somebody binges on something like that regularly, like almost on a daily basis, it could impact their progress. And I want them to progress. So I might say, okay, let's avoid that for a while. But the whole goal will eventually be to try and reincorporate it back in, with a level of moderation, if we can achieve that.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of like going on a kind of a maintenance phase. Like if you're approaching nutrition in that way, where you might go in a fat loss phase or a muscle building phase, and in the maintenance phase, you're just kind of like you're not working on this trigger food, but then in the long term, you'll try and make progress, and you might bring it back in kind of slowly and gradually. That's a very
Absolutely.
very practical approach. And ice cream, big fan of it as well. The Halo Top ice cream is huge out here, and they have a whole range of selection out here. It's a fitness professional's dream.
I was really big on the Halo Tops and all of the kind of the related low-cal ice creams for a while, and then I just realized I just prefer real ice cream, and I'll just have a smaller portion of it, and I just prefer it a lot more. Maybe a few extra calories, a little bit more fat, but it's good. So, not that Halo Tops aren't good, and I've had some very, very good ones, but yeah, I just prefer the real deal.
Yeah, and then you're testing your flexibility as well, because you're saying I'm going to make this fit into my lifestyle, my nutritional plan, but I'm not going to overdo it, and I'm going to use a little bit of restraint, which is having the best of both worlds, really.
Absolutely.
Yeah, something that this makes me think of kind of related is like protein bars and stuff like these kind of foods that are kind of in the gray area, where it's like, oh, they're high in protein, but they taste exactly like a candy bar. Do you have any kind of opinion on the health benefits or the lack of health benefits of these types of foods?
So everybody assumes that because like I'm kind of in this whole fitness sphere, or whatever, that I eat a load of protein bars, and I don't eat them a lot. I tend to get them from friends a lot, so, and I only ever buy them myself if I'm getting them on a discount. But I do buy them for a reason, and that is because I find them incredibly convenient at times. So for example, like today, I went for a really, really long cycle with a friend of mine, and I brought a couple of protein bars because I knew that they would be they're super portable. Like, I could just throw them in the back. I like to get protein in relatively regularly during the day. And if I'm going to be away from home, and if I want to get like, a little a protein topper on a meal, like, so for example, if I get a meal out and I don't get a huge amount of protein in it, I might just have a protein bar afterwards just to top it up. But it's not something I eat regularly, and they're not something that I personally find, okay, like once I've started and had one, I want more and more and more. They're tasty, but I don't think they're that level of tasty. Also, anybody who's experienced let's say the gastrointestinal effects of eating a number of protein bars at the same time will tell you it's just not worth it.
Yeah, they're too good to be true. It's taken in too high doses for sure. Yeah. And then just speaking of protein, and your specialty is aging and sarcopenia. How does protein intake change, kind of across the lifespan? I've heard our ability to actually, I won't comment. I'll just let you tell us because you're the expert. So yeah, how does it change over the lifespan?
Expert in again, in air quotes. Yeah. So one thing, like you mentioned, sarcopenia, and sarcopenia is kind of like one of the main focuses of my research. And for anybody who's not familiar, sarcopenia is the loss of muscle mass and function as we get older. So the way I kind of say it to people is that if you can remember your, let's say, grandmother when you were a child, and if you're an adult now and you think about, she probably looks maybe a little bit smaller, a little bit almost, I don't like saying it, but a little bit shriveled up. And as older people get older, they tend to lose muscle, and it tends to make them look a little bit kind of smaller and weaker and frailer. And it is actually a very, very serious condition, because sarcopenia is associated with a number of, let's say, long-term knock-on effects. So for example, we know that people who have sarcopenia are at a greater risk of heart disease. cardiovascular disease. They're at a greater risk of diabetes. They're at a greater risk of some cognitive decline. They're at greater risk of falling, just because they're not as strong and as they're not able to react as quickly as they used to be. And because they're at a greater risk of falling, they're also at a greater risk of osteoporosis, which means that they're at a greater risk of breaking a hip when they fall. And we know that when older people break a hip or have a serious fracture, they're at a greater risk of death within the coming year as well. So sarcopenia is a pretty serious condition, but like people often wonder, why does sarcopenia happen? And is it something that's kind of inevitable? And there are, let's say, two main reasons behind sarcopenia. One is as we get older, we tend to become a lot less active. So we move a lot less, we do a lot less exercise and a lot less physical activity in general. And the main stimulus for building and maintaining muscle is physical activity. It is by far, it is better than any protein that you will have, or any other supplement that you take, any legal supplement that you take for building muscle. And as we get older, we exercise less, we move less, and our body realizes we don't need to hold on to that much muscle, so we lose a lot of it. And then besides that lack of activity, there's also something called anabolic resistance. And anabolic resistance is the reduced reactivity of our body to anabolic stimuli. So anabolic stimuli are, like I mentioned, exercise. And then the other one is protein ingestion. So normally if we exercise, it stimulates something that called muscle protein synthesis. And if we eat protein, that also stimulates muscle protein synthesis. But our body's reaction to protein and exercise as we get older, it gets dulled. It becomes less and less. And that's called anabolic resistance. And there's a number of reasons for it. There's insulin resistance as we get older. We have reduced vascularity within our muscles. So we've got less blood vessels within our muscles, which actually inhibits their function, their ability to grow. We have poor digestion as we get older. So we don't absorb as much protein from food anymore. And these all add up over time, and greater levels of inflammation. I should mention that as well, just because it's a considerable effect. And all of these add up over time. And it means that despite the fact that we might be doing similar things to a young person in terms of like exercise and eating protein, it's not having as great an effect on older people. And just to make that kind of to help people visualize that, in younger people, we know that about 20 grams of a high quality protein like whey protein is enough to relatively maximally stimulate muscle protein synthesis. But in a 70-year-old, they may need double that or more. So 40 grams of protein, 40 grams of whey protein, just to stimulate muscle protein synthesis to the same amount. So that's a considerable amount of protein. And so my research focuses on increasing the amount of protein in older people's diets with some other dietary changes in order to help them overcome that anabolic resistance. And then we incorporate resistance exercise, so training with weights to help them build muscle. So they're basically fighting back against that sarcopenia, that loss of muscle over time, and hopefully improving their cardiometabolic health.
So we actually, by the sounds of it, need more protein as we get older. Is that right?
Absolutely, yeah. And the interesting thing is just to mention that as well. Like we already know that older people in general don't eat a lot of protein, especially at breakfast, for example. Like in the UK, if you look at UK food records, older people, they're probably getting like about 12 grams of protein at breakfast, because when you think of it, older people, are they having maybe a couple of slices of toast and maybe some cereal or something like that. It's not a very high protein meal. So we need to kind of focus on increasing that amount of protein for them.
Right, yeah. And in terms of like activity lowering as we get older, do you think it's harder to exercise as you get older, or do you think people, it's like in the culture that and in society that we should slow down as we age? What do you think is the cause of people exercising less?
I think it's a combination of both. I think it's definitely within the culture that people think somebody's getting older. They don't need to do as much. They don't need to do as much heavy lifting. They don't need to do as much walking. People are more willing to accept help from other people. And like I like, just to give you an example, I'm from a farming background, and my father has worked every single day of his life hard on the farm. And I just know now he's coming close to, like, he's getting very, very close to retirement. He should be retired, in my opinion. But I know he's doing less because he's older, and he feels like he kind of deserves that chance to do less. And I completely agree with him. The great thing about my dad is he recently got big into spinning, because it's a way for him to increase his physical activity as well. So there is that culture of like letting people kind of relax more as they're older, which I think is fantastic. But we can relax more without kind of saying goodbye to physical activity at all. But then for some individuals, especially individuals who have never had let's say, a background in sports or any form of physical activity, as they get older, they get, obviously, their muscle mass decreases, their muscle function and strength decreases, and exercise is genuinely difficult. And what I say is, when we're kind of prescribing exercise to older individuals, or anybody really, it's very, very important to start at their level. Okay. So their level may be chair exercise. By chair exercises, for anybody who's not familiar, it's like, having somebody sitting in a chair, and their exercise might be standing up out of the chair and sitting down and standing up a few times, just to work on their quads, working on, and those are essential movements. Like standing up and sitting out of a chair, it might sound easy to everybody, but that's an essential movement of daily life. Or you could have some older person, you say, okay, I want you to walk up and down the stairs 10 times, and do that a couple of times a day. And again, and that's starting at their level, because the worst thing you could do is say, okay, bring somebody who's never exercised their life, they're 75 years old, 80 years old, bring them into a gym, and then I hate this word, you go beast mode on them, and you just like decide, okay, let's just do all of these machines. So tomorrow you're probably going to have rhabdo, and you're going to like feel that you want your muscles just to fall off your body so you don't have to feel them anymore. I think that's a terrible way to do it, because that's a great way of saying to somebody, okay, or encouraging somebody to never go back and exercise again. So start at their level and build up from there, incorporating movements that they can do and that they will be able to do over time as they get stronger.
Yeah, just because Joe Rogan had rhabdo one time doesn't make it cool or something that you should try and aim for. Yeah. I don't know where this idea of muscle soreness came out of. People, I didn't feel sore after the workout, or I did feel sore after the workout, and that means I had a good or a bad workout. It's like, no, that's no, just because, if you are saving money, for example, and you felt the pinch the next day or whatever, I can't get my lunch today because I'm saving so much. It's like, you wouldn't equate that as a good, day saving. Like, it's silly where that idea came from.
It's very, very much the no pain, no gain mentality that some people have. Actually, and just to give another example, I don't want to go on about it, but I had a client recently who had never. She said I wanted to incorporate some resistance exercise into our program, and she wanted to because she wanted to get stronger and fitter. But she was very, very nervous about going to the gym, because she said anytime that she had gone to the gym in the past, she had suffered from terrible DOMs, and she absolutely hated it. And I said, okay, and how long did you continue on with it for? And was it like, and in her mind, it was like going to the gym, lifting weights was DOMs all the time. And she said, no, like if I got the DOMs, I would never go back. And I said, okay, let's do this. We're going to start really, really easy, like a couple of sets of these exercises. And I can promise you that within 2 weeks, you will not be feeling DOMs anymore. Okay. So she went for the first week, and she said, okay, I'm a little bit sore this week, but it's not terrible. Okay. And that was again my bad. Like I probably overprescribed, even though I was being hyper cautious with her. Within 2 weeks, we were speaking again, and I said, so are you feeling any of those DOMs? And she was like, no, which she said begrudgingly almost. And now she absolutely loves the gym. She was never somebody who went to the gym, but now she absolutely loves it as part of her daily routine. She goes like in the middle of the day, like on her lunch break, and she's like a completely different person. But it was really, really important to help her get out of that mentality of like, you're going to hurt every time you work out. And a lot of people have that. And I can understand it, because, some PTs, they like to do that to people at their first sessions. Like, yeah, let them let them know that they worked out the next day, which I think is a terrible approach.
Yeah, long term, the no pain, no gain isn't sustainable because you can't always get to the point where you're going to feel it the next day, and you don't want to because you have to train maybe a couple of times in a week, and you don't want to be crippled. But that story actually just about your dad was amazing. That he actually still wanted to exercise when he was older. I'd guess that he probably wasn't very injury prone, or he didn't have a lot of injuries if he's able to be working so long. Is that right, or does he have a lot of injuries?
uh, God, if you knew my dad, you wouldn't say that he's not injury prone. Working on a farm, everything happens. So yeah, my dad's had multiple injuries, like that I've seen him over the course of the past however many years of our life. But he's had plenty. He actually had a nasty spill a few years ago, which he hasn't fully recovered from in terms of his knee. So it makes certain movements very, very difficult. But spinning is actually it's very, very easy for him to do because it's not it doesn't stress his knee in that specific way. So it's I think it's fantastic for him. It's a great cardiovascular workout, and it's also a great social opportunity for him because obviously we're in the countryside, and this would be one of the kind of the few opportunities he has during the week to speak with other people, and I think that's great for him as well. That's another major benefit of group exercise.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Exercise, you can find your own community where we're so disconnected in the kind of digital age we're in. It's hard to find. And a kind of a lie I like to tell myself, is it's kind of an educated lie, is that I'm more resilient because I work out and I exercise. So like, not that I'm, Superman and I'm able to take on, and any kind of challenge or anything like that, but like I'm more robust, and in the face of an injury, I'll bounce back quicker. Or, I had a nasty accident with my shoulder, I dislocated my shoulder. And I tell myself, because I was exercising before that, and because I rehabbed with exercise, basically the overarching benefit of exercise that you wouldn't think of is you bounce back quicker from a setback or an injury. And injuries just you just take them in your stride when you're already exercising, really.
Yeah, I think like being physically fit and exercising regularly and building a certain base level of strength, it improves your life in a huge amount of ways in terms of like, God, like walking up a stairs it just feels easy. But like recovery like that is a really, really important one to talk about as well. And like it has a lot of metabolic benefits as well. I'm very, very cautious to kind of say like, so I would say it like I think saying somebody's more resilient is a really, really good way of saying it, instead of saying somebody's completely bulletproof, because I know that there's a lot of like gurus on the internet that like to talk about how being metabolically healthy will save you from virtually every condition going around, like it is a total panacea or something like that. Like I think in nutrition we have to talk about risk, and you can only reduce your risk, you can never eliminate it entirely. And like this is me as a nutritionist and somebody who works with exercise in clinical trials. I think they're fantastic. I think they're absolutely amazing, but they are not guarantees of eternal health by any means.
Absolutely, yeah. We can't rule out the risk completely. We can just minimize it. Yeah.
Exactly.
So then just going on to some of your posts that were pretty interesting. It's one of them was just about how like stronger people tend to live longer. There was a study and they looked at like grip strength. Could you tell us just a little bit about like, maybe why stronger people live longer, and just a little bit about the actual post itself?
Yeah, so strong. What we see with that is that people who, so I obviously mentioned sarcopenia and saying that it's the loss of muscle mass and muscle function. What we see, if we look a little bit more closely at the research, is that the relationship between muscle function and specifically muscle strength with long-term mortality is probably stronger than the relationship with muscle mass. So what I think is important to say with that is like, just because somebody has a lot of muscle mass doesn't automatically mean that they're super healthy. But if somebody is stronger than other people of the same age, it is a very, very good indication. So with older people, we do see that increased grip strength, or even increased lower body strength. So leg press, for example, is often used in the research, tends to be associated with a lower risk of mortality. And that is probably because people who are stronger and people who are stronger are probably more physically active. And on top of that, they potentially have a, better, let's say, health habits overall. So, they may eat a little bit better. They may get a little bit of protein. Like a lot of this is very, very difficult to kind of deduce from this kind of observational research. But they may have a healthier dietary pattern overall, healthier habits overall, and that helps them to maintain muscle mass. It helps them to maintain strength over time. And then that's associated with that lower risk of death.
So kind of going back to what we said earlier, there's no black and white answer. It's like, it's multifactorial, it's a gray.
Oh, yeah. Unfortunately, in nutrition, there's no black and white answers. And I think if somebody starts giving you black and white answers, turn around and run the other direction. I think that's a decent piece of advice to give.
Yeah. I suppose on the flip side, the nice thing about that is there's loads of little things you can do to, increase your longevity. It's not just like you have to do exercise or you have to eat right. You can sleep well as well. For example, there's loads of little things you can do.
Absolutely. Obviously, I'm going to talk about the benefits of exercise and eating well a lot, just because it's my field. But yeah, like you've mentioned, there are other habits that people should incorporate. But I think when we incorporate multiple good habits together, that's when we really, really start to see a lot of the benefits coming together.
And even just something we kind of touched on is the social element of health, like, having a good social circle, being well connected. You're back home, I'm sure you've got like plenty of people to catching up with, or talking about your dad, and having the group classes, like, that's really overlooked and a very, very important part of health, especially, during the pandemic as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think if you look at like longevity studies, when they talk about blue zones, one of the common factors within blue zones, besides the healthier diet, the kind of the less urban environments, is the fact that a lot of these people have very, very good social networks and social support groups. And that's something that's really, really difficult to quantify within research. I know, like as a nutritionist, I can't imagine how somebody would kind of go into the field and, like, let's say, okay, do we count your friends? Do we count your, every time you talk to a friend or something like that? But it seems to have an absolutely massive effect on improving people's quality of life, which I think is not spoken about enough. But yeah, from an outcome basis, it's really good for just basically improving people's longevity and keeping people alive longer. I don't know, maybe it's just because, if you've got more friends, you've got more reason to live longer, something like that. What do I know? It's not my field.
Yeah, or even the quality of friendships. You might have a small but close, circle as well. That could be another way. It could be benefiting your quality of life.
Those meaningful.
Yeah. I think this is something that women are better at than men, having, better quality friendships. They say men don't open up and that kind of stuff. And speaking of women, the other post was about how women, they can lose muscle up to 10 years earlier. That's something I hadn't heard before. Is that like something that women should expect, or what's the kind of the differences between men and women with aging?
Yeah, so sarcopenia, a lot of people talk about it and they say sarcopenia really starts, in your 50s or something like that. But if we look a little bit more closely at and it's really important to talk about like general populations here, because I'm sure that there's a lot of people like, who listen to this and they're probably very, very fit and healthy and they exercise regularly and they say, I'm not going to lose my muscle mass earlier than that, or I'm not going to lose muscle mass at all. But I think in the general population, where people generally don't exercise, we see that people start to lose muscle mass quite early in life. Like, so women tend to lose it in their late 30s, men in their late 40s from there. And so women lose it a little bit earlier. We don't know exactly why, but one reason that has been put forward is potentially because women engage in less strenuous physical activity than men. Okay. So that is a possibility. So they've got less of that stimulus for maintaining muscle mass. And again, I'm saying that, and I need to add the caveat that, like, I'm sure, again, a lot of the female listeners to this show would probably say, like, I exercise regularly. we have to think about the general population, and the general population, in general, the general population doesn't have a lot of healthy habits when it comes to either food or physical activity. So what happens there can be a little bit different to, let's say, the health conscious population.
Yeah, there's a lot of factors that I think a lot of people the general population aren't aware of, that conspire against your long-term health. Like, you've no bad intentions with your health, but like the food in the supermarket, it's, for the most part, there's a lot of crap food out there. The ability to do exercise, it's very difficult if you're not very conscious about it. So we're not blaming anyone. We're just saying the facts, really.
I think that's actually a really good point to say that, like, I think people shouldn't be blaming themselves, at least not entirely. Like, again, this is a completely different conversation for another day. But like, the environment that we live in really does conspire against us in terms of it. Our environment is not exactly, let's say, ideal for maintaining a healthy population, and that's in terms of like our environment it makes being inactive very, very easy, and it makes eating a lot of, let's say, lower quality food a lot easier as well.
Yeah, speaking of lower quality food, so when I was back doing my postgrad, I was getting really into the research in nutrition, and I came across the thing called a food desert. Have you ever heard of that before?
I'm familiar with the term. I haven't looked into it a huge amount. Yeah.
Yeah. So when I came across it, I was like, oh, yeah, sure. If you live near a food desert, or basically a place where all the food there is highly processed, it's really low quality. Like, there's very few fruit and vegetables. Think of lots of candy and all, sodas and ice cream, all that kind of stuff. And, I was back in Ireland, and I realized there was one in San Francisco in the Tenderloin. It's like, an impoverished area. And I was like, oh, that's so cool. And then I'm like, actually, it's not. That's really a sad thing that such a rich and wealthy city has one of the worst places for nutrition, that you can think of. It's like an actual coined term. So people mightn't even be aware of that, oh, this is just the local corner store or whatever, but it's actually causing you health issues long-term by shopping there if you're not aware of it. That's just absolutely the reality of the situation. Something that came to mind is, if women lose muscle potentially 10 years earlier in the general population, how is it then that the life expectancy for women is longer? It's a bit of a tricky question. I'm putting you on the spot here now, but any ideas why?
No, so there again, that's again probably multifactorial as well. So for example, you said that women are better communicators than men, and that could potentially lead to them having more long-term meaningful relationships that basically helps them maintain a certain level of longevity. Another thing with women is that they are more risk averse than men. So what I often say is, men are absolute agists and will do stupid things a lot more regularly than women, and that reduces our life expectancy. Women tend to have better eating habits in general. So women tend to follow more, let's say, prudent dietary patterns, which, basically women eat better. They have, and that kind of has an effect on their health longer down the line. Women have the benefit of having estrogen in their body for a long period of time, until their menopause. And then if they go on HRT, they continue to have estrogen. And that estrogen has a lot of benefits in terms of cardiovascular health and reducing women's risk of coronary heart disease. So yeah, there are multiple other factors that kind of can explain why women tend to live longer than men.
Yeah. So they lose more muscle, but in the end, they have the last laugh.
Yeah, oh God, I hate to think they're laughing at us because they live a little bit longer and we're dying off. But yeah, I guess.
So then the study you put out 1st of October last year, sarcopenia during the COVID lockdown. So the long-term health effects of short-term muscle loss. So that's a very interesting heading. So you would think, oh, I was locked down for a year or 18 months or whatever it was, and I wasn't as active as I'd like to be. Sure, I'll be fine. I'll bounce back. But did you find any long-term health effects to the lockdown, or what were the main findings there?
So that was a review study. So what happened was when lockdown happened, obviously our research got put on hold because everybody was in lockdown. We couldn't go anywhere, and like it just kind of popped into my head that like, you know, these conditions are absolutely horrendous for maintaining muscle mass, and there's probably a number of reasons for that. So I said we should look into this and we should write something up on this. So we started looking at so it was a big review paper, in fairness, but we looked at a lot of the different factors that could contribute to muscle loss during lockdown. And so, for example, one, being in the home and not being as active as normal, massive one. Okay, a lot of people, like if you look at some of the data that was available, step counts dropped dramatically at the initial stages of lockdown. And like I know for a fact, since I've been working from home, my step count is like I won't say how low it goes, but it's embarrassingly low. And a lot of people have done the same. And we know that even with just lowering step counts, we can lose muscle mass in certain populations, especially if they're not doing any type of exercise. We know that stress levels are quite high because a lot of people were feeling anxiety due to lockdown. That long kind of, let's say, chronic stress can lead to elevated levels of cortisol, which can, again, reduce muscle mass. It can also affect sleep. We know that like once somebody's sleep becomes reduced, it's harder to maintain muscle. And if we lose weight, we tend to lose muscle before we lose fat. So we've got this body recomposition over time where people are losing muscle and gaining fat. And then when people are at home as well, there's also the issue of comfort eating, where people are, like dealing with the stress by eating, and they're often eating what we call ultra processed foods, which are just easy to get and convenient to have in the house, and tend to be quite low in protein, very, very easy to overeat. So there are multiple factors that can kind of contribute to muscle loss during the pandemic. So we spoke about those factors, and then we spoke about like the long-term potential health effects that could come from this muscle loss. And we also spoke about the fact that, if somebody who gets COVID, they may end up in intensive care. And if they're in intensive care, they may be, even less active. They may be in a bed for a week or even 2 weeks at a time. And when somebody is bedbound like that, muscle loss happens incredibly quickly. And in older people, because they don't exercise as regularly, sometimes they'll never regain all of the muscle that they lose. And then that kind of leads to a bit of a rehabilitation crisis potentially after lockdown. And we see now that, like in some of the research, the more recent research, that there is a major need for rehab for a lot of individuals post ICU or post COVID infection.
Sounds almost like a perfect storm for sarcopenia, as in, especially
Absolutely.
if you're a bit older as well. Something let me know your thoughts on this, but something I try to remind myself and tell clients is, let's just say it took you, 5 years to get to your peak level of physical fitness, just, throwing out arbitrary numbers here. You had something like the pandemic come along where it took you, off your kind of your normal plan, and your health kind of took a backward step. It took you 5 years to get to your peak, but to get back to your peak, it'll take, half the time or less, provided you follow the same habits that took you up to your peak. Would you agree with that you can bounce back far quicker? Or, what would be your kind of thoughts around getting back after the pandemic to your best physically?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of people were worried about that, especially a lot of people in the fitness community that are like, I'm going to lose all my gains because of lockdown. But the truth is, I think building muscle initially, it's a painstaking process and it takes ages. It takes so bloody long. But I find if we lose that muscle, regaining it is not as hard, and it's a lot quicker, and even regaining strength is a lot quicker as well. And I think most people let's say most people who have experienced lifting weights, they would have experienced that after lockdowns when they finally got to go back to the gym. It was obviously difficult. They had lost strength initially, but within a few weeks, within a month or something like that, they were probably back quite close to their, let's say their previous levels of strength. And yeah, that's the thing with muscle. Like that, there's a couple of different reasons for it. Potentially, one of them is like satellite cell incorporation over time. We know that having built muscle in the first place, we usually incorporate satellite cells into our muscles, and they tend to stay around for a long time. So that means if we lose muscle, they're there, and it makes rebuilding, it makes all of that whole process of muscle protein synthesis a lot easier the second time around. So there's probably a lot of different explanations for it, but yeah, I would say to people, like, don't worry too much about it. I would even go as far as to say, like, don't worry about it at all. Do a little bit of exercise, and you'd be surprised with how much muscle you can maintain, even if you're not going to the gym. And then, like, once you get back to the gym, you'll be right as rain in a month's time. I think people really catastrophize the whole lockdown a little bit more than it should have been for some individuals. For older individuals, I think it was a problem because we're talking to older individuals that don't exercise at all anyway.
Yeah. And then as well, it's like you'll only lose muscle if you're in a deficit. Is that correct to say?
I wouldn't say that. I'd say being in a deficit definitely makes it easier. I think if somebody's not active, and even if they're eating at maintenance, and especially in the conditions that we mentioned, like, with poor sleep and stuff like that, it is very, very possible to lose muscle because, and if somebody's not exercising, they don't have a reason to hold on to that muscle. So not, and I really want to kind of to add a caveat of saying, I'm not saying that muscle turns into fat. I'm just saying that if somebody's not exercising, your body's not going to hold on to that muscle as much. And if you're not eating in a deficit, if you're eating at a certain level of maintenance, you're going to see a body composition change where, you're probably going to gain a little bit of body fat and you're just going to lose a little bit of muscle.
Okay, yeah. So I guess, don't sweat the small stuff and just try and get back to whatever semblance of a routine you can with your exercise and nutrition. And, it's a long-term game, so we can make a lot of progress over the long term. Yeah. All right. And just to wrap up the last one. So, it wouldn't be a chat between two Irish lads if we didn't talk about drink. So the study you had on the genetic individuality and alcohol consumption. So is there a genetic component to, how people interact with drink, and just, your thoughts on that study and anything that would be of note to mention?
Yeah, so that was a chapter that we wrote for a book on nutrigenetics and nutrigenomics. And just like for anybody who's not familiar, nutrigenetics is looking at how our genes basically affect or are affected by the foods that we eat over time. So our chapter looks specifically at alcohol. And there are a couple of relatively common let's say gene mutations that can affect how somebody interacts with alcohol. So just like to give people an idea, when we consume alcohol, alcohol is, our body would consider it a toxin. And I mean that in the genuine sense of the word. It has a toxic effect on our body, and our body's like, we need to detoxify this stuff and get it out as soon as possible. So we convert it into, we convert it into an aldehyde, and then we convert it into an acid afterwards. So it's a two-stage process. And so we've got a couple of different enzymes that help us to do that. And within those enzymes, we've got different genotypes of people who can produce different versions of those enzymes. And sometimes those enzymes are not as effective or are differently effective to other ones. So, for example, what we can sometimes see is that when somebody, if they've got a genetic mutation in the first enzyme, which converts ethanol into the aldehyde form, we know that the aldehyde form is actually more toxic than the ethanol form, but it's just an intermediary. So if we have individuals, they've got very, very efficient enzymes that convert into that aldehyde form of alcohol very, very quickly. And what happens is we convert it so quickly, if we don't have a corresponding way to get rid of that alcohol, that aldehyde quickly enough in time, that is where we get a lot of the negative effects of alcohol. So if you think of somebody who's drunk, for example, they may be slurring their speech, they may have, red cheeks, and like basically what you think about a drunk person is those individuals, they actually get drunk easier because they've got a very hyper efficient enzyme. Okay, that is produced. That's basically it's converting into this aldehyde intermediary very, very efficiently and making people experience alcohol sickness. On the other end, we've also got individuals who have very, very slow versions of the second enzyme specifically. So they're not detoxifying this aldehyde form efficiently enough. So the aldehyde builds up in our body and we get extreme effects of alcohol sickness. And interestingly enough, some of those alleles, those genetic mutations are quite common in, let's say, East Asian populations. So, for example, places like China and Japan. And some people will say, like, people from those areas of the world, they don't handle their liquor as well as people from, let's say, Europe. And that is true to a certain extent. And like I actually lived in Japan for a number of years, and I can testify to that because I've seen people get completely hammered on like a half pint of beer. And like literally within minutes, their face is completely red and they're slurring their speech. So yeah, it happens. But there are other effects as well. So for example, some individuals with there's a gene called the I'm not going to say what it's called, but it's the MTHFR gene. It has a certain name within the community, and it's to do with homocysteine detoxification. And we know that if people are basically, if they have got an inefficient form of that gene, it doesn't detoxify homocysteine as efficiently as it should. And we know that if somebody is consuming a lot of alcohol and they have this genetic mutation, it can lead to a higher incidence of certain cancers as well. So basically, the whole chapter was looking at different ways that consumption of alcohol can lead to different conditions because of different mutations within our genes. Not necessarily always for the way we detoxify alcohol, but with multiple other genes as well. So there's a lot. Some individuals are just more prone to either getting drunk, or some people are more prone to getting fatty liver. Some people are more prone to cancer because of drinking alcohol. So it's like the world is very, very unfair in certain cases. Like we all have different risk because of our different genes. And I think that was kind of the overarching idea of that specific chapter when it comes to alcohol consumption. Some people can drink it and they get by fine. Others, it is very detrimental to their health.
Yeah, that reaction to drink, something I noticed in myself. I kind of get like, my skin goes a bit red or a bit puffy. I'm not sure what type of drink, but certain ones just randomly it'll happen. So there's definitely some sort of genetic component to it. I feel like there's the makings of a big idea there. If you could do genetic testing, you could figure out, this person shouldn't drink, this person, you have a great tolerance, this person, you'd be wary of this kind of type of drink, or, this health condition. There's a big opportunity there if you could figure it out.
You know what? I think personalized nutrition like that has a very, very bright future. But I think we're still a little bit away from having the full understanding of how all of these genetic interactions happen. But yeah, I think that in the future that will become a major part of medicine, I think, and nutrition.
And just in terms of like a practical kind of like a little bit of advice around like alcohol consumption and health and stuff, like what do you typically recommend clients do? I know we don't have a client in front of us to give specific recommendations, so it's kind of how long is a piece of string, but it's always a tricky one for me working with clients. Do you have any thoughts on that about, how to be healthy and also, if you have a bit of alcohol, if you like it?
It's a tough one because I don't actually drink myself at all. I never have. So that's one area where I find it kind of hard to relate to clients. But I will say to them, look, I just say, look, alcohol does have calories as well. Let's bear that in mind when, we're going out and eating. I do kind of encourage them, just from a health perspective, not to consume alcohol a lot on their own and potentially leave it for kind of social occasions when they're out. But I do also have a lot of clients who will, enjoy a glass of wine or potentially two with the odd meal at home. And like, who am I to argue with that? Because it's part of the Mediterranean diet, right?
Oh yeah, sure it is. And, apparently they live the longest. So, who are we to argue?
Yeah, exactly. They seem to be doing rather well for themselves.
All right, Richie, thanks very much for your time. Is there anything you want to mention or tell people about, or have you anything coming up? Maybe even some publications or anything you're working on?
Yeah, God, I got a couple of publications in the pipeline at the moment. I've just gone through a few months of absolute heartache trying to get revisions for one done. I won't say anything about it yet because it hasn't been accepted, but touch wood, that'll get accepted for publication soon, and that'll be all. Like I let everybody know once I make a publication. I let people know on my social media. So if anybody wants kind of to follow me on that, that'd be brilliant. And if anybody has any questions about my research or anything like that, I'm always happy to chat with people on Instagram. I'm as a researcher, I should be more active on Twitter. I am not. I'm awful at using it, but I'm trying at least to
You
get
might be
better.
better off. It's a bit of a cesspool at times.
To be honest, Instagram is as well. But yeah, if anybody wants to drop me a question, I'm always happy to answer anything I get there as well.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Richie.